In the fall of 2012, Walt Ingram's son Dale drove the county road through Boone County, Iowa, that his grandfather had driven since 1948, and his father had driven since 1974, and counted the farms that were still in the same family they had been in when the farm crisis of the 1980s began. He counted one, his own. There had been 7 working farm families on that 4-mile stretch of county road in 1980. The Ingrams, the Schotts, the Halversons, the Bremer family, the Wicks operation, the Paulson place, the Koenig farm at the south end. 7 families, 7 operations, several thousand acres of Boone County, Iowa, corn and soybean ground farmed by people whose fathers and in some cases grandfathers had farmed it before them. By 1992, 4 of the 7 had sold or been foreclosed. By 2000, 2 more had transferred to non-family ownership through retirement sales that would not have happened without the debt pressure of the 1980s accelerating the timeline. By 2012, Dale Ingram was driving past farmsteads owned by a corporate farming operation out of Des Moines, a retired insurance agent from Ames who had bought the Paulson ground as an investment, and a seed company that had picked up the Schott acreage from the Federal Land Bank in 1989 for 60 cents on the dollar. The Ingram farm was 160 acres. It had been 160 acres when Dale's grandfather, Howard, bought it in 1948. It was 160 acres when Howard handed it to Walt in 1974. It was 160 acres when Walt handed it to Dale in 2001. It had never been larger. It had never been foreclosed. It had never changed family hands. It had been called too small to survive since approximately 1974, when Gene Schott had started buying adjacent ground and suggesting to Walt that staying at 160 was farming yourself into irrelevance. Gene Schott's 680 acres were now owned by a seed company. Walt's 160 were still the Ingram farm. Let me tell you about Howard Ingram, because you need to understand the rule before you can understand the farm that survived by following it. Howard had bought the Boone County 160 in 1948 for $28,000, $175 per acre, financed with a federal land bank loan at 4% interest over 25 years. He had paid it off in 14 years, making double principal payments in every year the corn price allowed it, carrying the minimum payment in the 2 years it did not. He had paid off the land in 1962 and had never borrowed against it again. From 1962 onward, Howard had operated the farm on a single financial principle that he had arrived at through the specific experience of watching neighbors borrow against rising land values in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and then struggle when corn prices dropped in 1953 and again in 1955. He had watched the pattern clearly: borrow when prices are high, service the debt when prices are normal, lose the farm when prices are low. He had decided he would not participate in the pattern. His rule was, never borrow what a bad corn year cannot pay, not a good year, not an average year. He was not interested in whether the debt could be serviced in an average year. He was interested in whether it could be serviced in the worst single year he was likely to face in any given decade. He estimated that worst year as corn at $1.40 per bushel. The approximate floor corn had shown In the lowest price years of the 1940s and 1950s, on 160 acres at 80 bushels per acre in a drought, producing 12,800 bushels at $1.40, grossing $17,920 before inputs. With input costs of approximately $40 per acre in the 1960s, his net at the bad year corn price was approximately $11,520. He would not borrow more than that number could service. He had been offered land purchase opportunities in the 1960s when adjacent parcels came available at reasonable prices. He had declined every one of them, not because he did not want more land, not because the opportunities were not real, because in each case the additional debt load at the bad corn year calculation would have produced a negative cash flow. He had told Walt, when Walt asked in 1968 why they didn't buy the Halverson quarter when it came available, at a bad corn year price, we cannot pay what we'd owe. He had said, a farm you cannot pay for in a bad year is not your farm. It is the bank's farm, and you are working it for them until the bad year comes. Walt had thought about this for a long time. He had understood the words before he understood the weight of them. He had understood the weight of them in 1985 when the bad year came and he drove past Gene Schott's farmstead on the way to the co-op and saw Gene's equipment in the yard with for sale signs on it. Let me tell you about the two paths from 1974 because they ran alongside each other for 15 years on the same county road, and the comparison between them is the whole story. Walt had taken over the Ingram farm in 1974 with $12,000 in equipment debt and no land debt. He had applied Howard's rule from the first day. He had calculated his bad corn year break-even at the current input cost levels higher than Howard's 1960s numbers because inputs had risen significantly by 1974, but the principle was the same. He had set his maximum debt service number and had not exceeded it. In 1974, corn was $3.02 per bushel. Land in Boone County was selling at $800 to $1,200 per acre, depending on quality. The Extension Office was publishing research showing that the optimal viable corn operation size was 400 to 600 acres. That below 400 acres, per unit equipment costs were too high, and per unit input purchasing volume was too low to compete with larger operations. The bank loan officers in Ames were calling small acreage farmers in for conversations about expansion financing. The message from every direction was, grow or fall behind. Walt had considered it. He had run the numbers with Howard's rule applied. At the 1974 corn price of $3.02, a debt service for 200 additional acres at $1,000 per acre, $200,000 in new debt at 8% interest, would have required $16,000 in annual interest alone. At the bad corn year price Walt estimated for the 1970s, $1.80 per bushel, based on the historical low periods adjusted for inflation. 360 acres at 100 bushels per acre at $1.80 produced $64,800 gross. At 1974 input costs of $120 per acre, net before interest was $21,600, against $16,000 in interest. That left $5,600 for family living, equipment maintenance, and unexpected costs. Walt had decided that $5,600 was not enough margin in a bad year. He had not expanded. Gene Schott had reached a different conclusion. Gene had been farming the Schott family's 240 acres since 1970. In 1974, with corn at $3.02 and land values rising, he had bought the Halverson Quarter, 160 acres at $1,100 per acre, $176,000, financed at 8%. In 1976, he had bought the adjacent Bremer ground, another 160 acres at $1,400 per acre, $224,000 at 10%. In 1979, he had bought the Wicks Quarter at $2,200 per acre, $352,000 at 11%. By 1981, he had 680 acres and $752,000 in land debt at a weighted average interest rate of 9.5%. At the 1979 corn price of $2.72 per bushel, Gene's 680 acres at 130 bushels per acre produced $240,448 gross. At input costs of $200 per acre, net before interest was $104,448. His annual interest service on the land debt alone was $71,440. That left $33,000 before equipment costs, family living, and operating loan service. The operation was viable in 1979. It was viable the way a large amount of debt is viable when the income assumptions underlying it are holding. Gene had told Walt at the co-op in the spring of 1979, "Walt, you are going to farm yourself into irrelevance at 160 acres." He had said this with the specific confidence of a man whose balance sheet was looking better every year the land values rose. He said, "The only way to stay viable in this county over the next 20 years is to get bigger." He said, 160 acres is a hobby farm. Walt had said, "I can pay for what I have in a bad year." Gene had said, "There's not going to be a bad year. The Soviets are buying corn, the dollar is weak, exports are up." He paused. "The trend is structural." Walt had said, "Every trend ends." He had driven home. He had not expanded. The trend ended in 1980. Let me tell you about what happened to the numbers on Gene Schott's 680 acres between 1980 and 1988, because the specific arithmetic of the farm crisis is the hidden advantage of Howard's rule made visible in the starkest possible way. In 1980, interest rates began their rise toward 21%. Gene's land debt, partly variable rate, began repricing upward. By 1982, his weighted average interest rate on the land debt had risen to 14%. His annual interest service on $752,000 at 14% was $105,280. In 1982, corn was $2.68 per bushel. Gene's 680 acres at 125 bushels per acre produced $227,800 gross. At input costs of $240 per acre, net before interest was $64,520, against $105,280 in interest. Negative $40,760 before equipment costs and family living. Gene had restructured the debt in 1982. The bank had agreed to a modified payment schedule that deferred a portion of the interest, adding it to the principal. The principal grew. The interest on the larger principal grew. By 1984, Gene's land debt had risen to $840,000 despite his efforts to make partial payments. In 1985, corn was $2.23 per bushel, net before interest on 680 acres, approximately $41,000. Annual interest service at 13% on $840,000, $109,200, negative $68,200. Gene sold 200 acres in the fall of 1986 for $680 per acre. The market had fallen from its 1981 peak of $2,400 per acre to $680, a reduction of 72%. He received $136,000 from the sale. He applied it to the debt. It was not enough. The Federal Land Bank foreclosed on the remaining 480 acres in the spring of 1988. Now let me tell you about what happened to the numbers on Walt Ingram's 160 acres across those same years, because the comparison is the complete argument. Walt's 160 acres in 1980 were debt-free. His annual financial obligation was his operating loan, seed, fertilizer, herbicide, fuel, which he took each spring at the current interest rate and paid at harvest. The operating loan in 1982 ran at 16% interest, which was painful, but the operating loan was small relative to the land debt Gene was carrying, because it was secured against one crop on 160 acres, rather than against the permanent value of 680 acres of Iowa farmland. In 1982, Walt's gross revenue was $33,500 on 160 acres at $2.68 corn. Operating costs were $22,400. Net, $11,100 before operating loan interest. Operating loan interest at 16% on approximately $12,000, $1,920. Net income, $9,180. Not much, not comfortable, but positive. Every year of the farm crisis, the Ingram operation had a positive net, not a good positive. In 1985, the worst year, Walt had made approximately $4,200 net income on the farm. But positive. Howard's rule held. Walt had never borrowed more than a bad corn year could pay. The bad corn years came. Walt paid. Let me tell you about the specific conversation at the co-op in the fall of 1988, because it is the scene where the two paths arrive at their destination. Gene had been at the co-op settling his final accounts after the foreclosure. He was still living on the farm. The Federal Land Bank had allowed him to remain through the harvest, and he was working out the last of his commitments before he turned the keys over. Walt had come in for seed corn for the following year. They had stood at the co-op counter for a moment. Gene had looked at Walt's seed order, 160 acres worth of seed corn, the same as it had always been. Gene said, "You are still at 160. Walt said, "Still at 160. Gene was quiet for a moment. He said, "You said you could pay for it in a bad year." Walt said, "Yes." Gene said, "Every year since 1982 has been a bad year." Walt said, "Yes." Gene said, "And you paid?" Walt said, "Yes." Gene looked at his own paperwork on the counter. He said, "I couldn't pay, not at the prices, not at the interest rates." He paused. "Nobody could at those numbers." Walt said, "I know." Gene said, "So how did you pay?" Walt said, "I didn't borrow what I couldn't pay." He looked at Gene. "My father's rule." He paused. Never borrow what a bad corn year cannot pay. Gene looked at the counter for a while. He said, "I thought there wouldn't be a bad year." Walt said, "My father thought there would always be one eventually." There was nothing more to say about it. Gene had believed in the trend. Howard had believed in the rule. The farm crisis had been the bad year that separated those two beliefs into their consequences. Gene drove away from the co-op in a truck that was no longer financed against 680 acres of Boone County farmland. He drove home to a farm he had 2 more months of rights to occupy. He was not a foolish man or a careless man. He had made a reasonable calculation in 1974, based on the information available to him and the consensus of the Extension Office and the loan officers and the economic trend lines. The calculation had been wrong, in the specific way that reasonable calculations made in good times are wrong. It had not accounted for the full weight of a sustained bad period, because a sustained bad period is not visible in the trend line of a sustained good one. Howard had not predicted the farm crisis of the 1980s. He could not have predicted it in 1948 or in 1962 or in 1974. He had simply refused to be in a position where a bad period he could not predict would take the farm. He had applied that refusal to every financial decision he made and had handed it to Walt as a principle rather than a prediction. Walt had handed it to Dale in 2001. The farm had been 160 acres in 2001. It was 160 acres in 2012. It was the only farm on the county road still in the same family it had been in 1980. Let me tell you about the ledger, because it is the object that carries everything in this story. Howard had started a farm ledger in 1948 when he bought the place. A composition notebook, 1 page per year, 4 columns, gross revenue, input costs, operating debt service, net cash. He had filled in the columns every November after the harvest was sold and the accounts were settled. He had kept the ledger in the desk in the farmhouse beside the phone. Walt had continued the ledger from 1974 forward. He had kept Howard's notebook with his own in the same desk drawer. When Dale had taken over in 2001, Walt had handed Dale both notebooks and shown him the 4 columns and the principle behind them. He had said, "Your great-grandfather did this every November." He had said, "You can see every year back to 1948 in these pages." He paused. Not one year negative. Dale had looked at the 63 years of November entries. He had found the 1985 entry, $4,200 net, the worst year in the ledger. He had looked at the entries on either side of it. 1984, $8,400 net. 1986, $6,100 net. 3 consecutive thin years, not zero, not negative. He had found the 1962 entry, the year Howard paid off the land note, $14,200 net, with a notation in Howard's handwriting, land paid. He had found the 1980 entry, the first year of the crisis, $11,800 net, with Walt's notation, neighbors in trouble. We are not. Dale runs the farm now. He keeps the ledger the same way Howard kept it and Walt kept it, 1 page per November, 4 columns. He has not expanded the acreage. He has not borrowed against the land. He applied Howard's rule to the 2008 operating loan when input prices spiked and corn prices were strong and the banks were again encouraging expansion. He ran the bad year calculation at $3.20 corn on 160 acres and found that the expansion debt service would leave him negative in a bad year. He did not expand. He will not expand until the bad year calculation shows he can pay. He may never expand. The Ingram farm may be 160 acres in Dale's son's hands the same way it was 160 acres in Walt's hands and Howard's hands. This is not failure. This is the specific definition of a farm that has never once in its history been the bank's farm. It has always been the Ingram farm. The ledger shows this on every page going back to 1948. Not 1 year negative. Not 1 year where the bank's number mattered more than the family's. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Stories of the rule applied every year for 60 years through every good year and every bad year without exception. Of the fathers who handed their sons a principle rather than a prediction. Of the neighbors who believed in the trend and the men who believed in the rule, and what the farm crisis showed about the difference. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. Tell me in the comments, what is the county road like near your family farm? How many of the original families are still there? The Ingram ledger is in the farmhouse desk. 2 composition notebooks, Howard's from 1948 to 1973, Walt's from 1974 to 2001, and Dale's current notebook from 2002 forward. 3 handwritings, 65 years of November entries, 4 columns per year, not 1 year negative. Howard said, "Never borrow what a bad corn year cannot pay." He said it once. Walt applied it for 27 years. Dale applies it now. The farm is 160 acres. It has always been 160 acres. It is the only farm on that county road still in the same family it was in 1980. Small was not the problem. Small, paid for, with no year negative. That was the only size that survived. Let me tell you about the specific way Howard built his bad corn year calculation, because understanding the calculation is understanding why the Ingram farm was still there in 2012 when 6 others on the same road were not. Howard had not arrived at the rule through any formal financial education. He had arrived at it by watching the 1953 and 1955 corn price drops affect farms around him in Boone County. In 1953, corn had dropped to $1.18 per bushel, from $1.63 the previous year, a 30% decline in a single season. Several of Howard's neighbors, who had borrowed at the 1952 corn price, found themselves short on debt service at the 1953 price. 2 of them restructured. 1 lost a parcel. Howard had watched this and made a decision about how he would calculate his own limits. He had set the bad corn year price at 30 to 40% below the current price, adjusted downward to the historical floor he had observed in the worst years he could personally remember or find records for. In the early 1960s, that floor was approximately $1.10 to $1.40 per bushel. He had set his acreage yield at 80% of his normal yield, accounting for a drought or other production event in the same bad year. He had applied those 2 numbers to the 160 acres and calculated the maximum gross revenue the farm could produce in a simultaneous price crash and yield reduction year. Whatever that number was after input costs was his maximum debt service. He had done this calculation every time a borrowing decision arose, every time, not when things looked good. Every time, He had done it when he refinanced the equipment in 1958 and when he bought a new combine in 1966, and when Walt asked in 1972 whether they should buy the Paulson 40 that was coming available. He had run the bad year numbers every time and had not deviated from the result. Walt had learned the calculation from watching Howard do it. When Walt took over in 1974, he had updated the numbers for the new input cost reality and the new corn price reality and had applied the same methodology. He had done this through the entire period when Gene Schott was expanding, had run the numbers on each of the expansion opportunities Gene described to him as obvious, and had found them negative in the bad year scenario every single time. He had not said, "Gene is wrong." He had said, "At the bad year corn price, I cannot pay this." That was the entire analysis. Gene's optimism about the trend was not the relevant variable. The bad year calculation was the relevant variable. Let me tell you about what happened to land values in Boone County between 1981 and 1986, because this is the mechanism that turned Gene's $752,000 in land debt from a manageable obligation into an unsurvivable one, and understanding it completes the picture. Gene's land debt was secured against the value of the land itself. When he borrowed $1,100 per acre for the Halverson ground in 1974, the lender had assessed the ground at $1,200 per acre and had lent against that assessed value. When the land value rose to $1,800 per acre by 1978, Gene had additional borrowing capacity. The increased asset value created more collateral headroom. He had used some of that headroom to buy the Wicks ground in 1979. This mechanism works as long as land values are rising. When land values fall, the mechanism reverses. The land that collateralized the debt is worth less than the debt it is securing. The lender's exposure exceeds the asset value. The lender begins asking for additional collateral, reduced principal, or restructured terms to bring the loan-to-value ratio back into compliance. Boone County land values peaked at approximately $2,400 per acre in 1981. By 1983, they had fallen to $1,600. By 1985, they had fallen to $980. By 1987, they had fallen to $640. Gene's 480 remaining acres, valued at $640 per acre in 1987, were worth $307,200. His remaining land debt was approximately $620,000. The Federal Land Bank held $620,000 of debt against $307,200 of collateral. There was no restructuring path that produced a survivable outcome. The foreclosure in 1988 was not a surprise. It had been mathematically predetermined since approximately 1985. Walt's 160 acres had no land debt in any of those years. The falling land values had no mechanism to affect his financial position. His ground was worth less per acre in 1985 than it had been in 1981, but since no debt was secured against it, the price change was irrelevant to his operation. He was farming the ground, not leveraging it. The land value was the background, not the instrument. This is the hidden advantage of Howard's rule made fully concrete. The rule's protection was not just that the debt service stayed manageable in a bad year. It was that when the full crisis arrived, falling prices and falling land values simultaneously, the Ingram operation had no mechanism through which the crisis could reach it. The crisis required land debt as a vector. Howard had removed that vector in 1962, and Walt had never restored it. Let me also tell you about 2008, because it is the year Dale faced the same conversation Walt had faced in 1979 and made the same calculation. In 2008, corn was $6 per bushel. Land in Boone County was selling at $4,200 per acre. The banks were encouraging expansion. The Extension Office was again publishing research showing that optimal viable operation size had increased. Now, 800 to 1,200 acres, rather than the 400 to 600 of the 1970s. The message was familiar: grow or fall behind. Dale had heard this message his whole life. He had heard it directed at his father and his grandfather. He ran the bad year calculation the way Howard had run it and Walt had run it. He set the bad year corn price at $3.20 per bushel, 47% below the 2008 price, consistent with the percentage drops in the worst historical periods. He set the yield at 80% of normal. He calculated what 400 acres at those numbers would produce after current input costs. He looked at the debt service on 240 additional acres at $4,200 per acre at current interest rates. The number was negative in the bad year scenario. He had called Walt, his father was retired in Ames by then, and told him what the calculation showed. Walt had said, "Then don't borrow it." Dale had said, "I know." Walt had said, "Has the rule changed?" Dale had said, "No." Walt had said, "Then the calculation is right." Dale had not expanded. He had planted his 160 acres in 2008 and harvested them and written the November entry in his notebook at $6 corn, and had been comfortable with what the column said. He had done the same in 2009 at $3.70 corn, and in 2012 at $7.40 corn, and in 2014 at $3.70 corn again. The bad corn year always comes eventually. Howard had known this. Walt had applied it. Dale knows it. The Ingram farm is 160 acres. The ledger is in the farmhouse. 3 notebooks, 3 handwritings, 65 years of November entries. Not 1 year negative. Howard said, "A farm you cannot pay for in a bad year is not your farm. It is the bank's farm, and you are working it for them until the bad year comes." Not 1 November entry in 65 years of farming has been the bank's number. Every one of them has been the Ingram family's number. That is not an accident. It is arithmetic, applied every year without exception, across 3 generations and 65 Novembers on 160 acres of Boone County, Iowa, that have never once been anyone's farm but the Ingrams. Let me tell you about what the road looked like to Walt in the years when the crisis was happening, because the experience of watching neighbors lose farms one at a time is not the same as reading about foreclosure numbers in an agricultural economics study. The Halversons had sold in 1983, not foreclosed, sold, because they had seen the numbers turning and had found a buyer before the Federal Land Bank was involved. The buyer was an Iowa State professor who had been looking for an investment and had gotten the 240 acres at a distressed price. The Halversons had moved to their daughter's property in Ames. Walt had stood the Halverson farmyard on the day the moving truck came and had not said much. Nora Halverson had said, "We had too much borrowed." Walt had said, "I know." There was nothing else to say about it. The Bremer operation had restructured twice between 1982 and 1985, and had sold 80 acres to a neighbor to service the debt, leaving them with 160 acres and a crippled operation that did not survive the 1986 corn price. The Bremer family had stayed on as renters of the ground they had farmed for 40 years. Walt had driven past the Bremer farmstead in the springs after that and had seen the rental arrangement working. The Bremers in the field, someone else's corn program, someone else's income from the ground. He had thought about Howard's sentence every time. The Wicks operation had been the first to foreclosure. 1984, quick and complete. The Wicks family had borrowed at the 1979 land price to buy the ground they were already renting, financing it entirely with operating loan money at floating rates. When the rates went to 19% and the corn price went to $2.50 simultaneously, the arithmetic had ended in about 6 months. The Federal Land Bank had taken the ground before the harvest was off. Walt had bid on the Wicks ground at the bank's resale auction in 1985. He had bid $480 per acre. His calculation of what the ground was worth at the bad corn year price capitalized at a reasonable return. The ground had sold to a corporate buyer at $510 per acre. Walt had driven home. His wife Helen had asked him that evening, "Did you want the Wicks ground?" Walt had said, "I wanted it at the price I bid." She said, "What would you have done with it?" He had thought about it. He said, "Farmed it the same way I farm ours." He paused. "But I wasn't going to pay more than the bad year price justified." He paused. "The corporate buyer can. I can't." Helen had said, "That seems like the rule working the way it's supposed to." Walt had said, yes, he had gone to do the evening chores. He had not bought additional ground at that auction or any other during the crisis years. The opportunity had been real. Land was selling at 60 and 70 cents on the dollar of its 1981 value. And he had not taken it, not because he did not want it, but because even at distressed prices, the debt service at the bad corn year calculation still showed a negative number. He had looked at every parcel that came to auction between 1984 and 1990 and had run the same calculation on everyone. None of them had passed. He had told Dale about this later, when Dale was old enough to understand it. He said, "Your grandfather did not tell me to buy only what the farm could pay for in a bad year. He told me never to borrow what a bad year could not pay." He said, "Those are not the same sentence." He paused. "One is about buying. One is about borrowing." Dale had looked at him. He said, "What is the difference?" Walt said, "You can buy ground for cash if you have it, and the price is right." He paused. "You cannot borrow to buy it if the bad year number says no." He looked at Dale. "We did not have the cash in 1985 to buy Wicks at any price, so we did not buy." He paused. "That is the rule working correctly." Dale had sat with that for a while. He had said, "You never had excess cash." Walt had said, "Howard made double principal payments every year he could. He put what was left in the operation." He paused. "A farm that is always paid for is not a farm that accumulates cash quickly." He looked at Dale. "It is a farm that is always paid for. This is the last thing about Howard's rule that matters, and that is easy to miss if you read the story as being only about survival. Howard's rule was not a defensive posture adopted in fear of the future. It was a positive statement about what the farm was and what it was for. The farm was for farming. It was not for leveraging. It was not an asset to borrow against or a balance sheet to optimize or a vehicle for accumulating equity in a rising market. It was the ground his family farmed. The purpose of owning it was to farm it. The requirement for farming it was being able to pay for it in the worst year that was likely to come. Everything else, the size, the equipment, the debt level, followed from that requirement. Gene Schott had treated the farm as an asset to leverage in a rising market. He had been correct that it was an asset, and correct that the market was rising. He had not been correct that the market would keep rising, or that the debt level safe at one corn price was safe at a lower one, or that a farm financed against its rising value in good years could be serviced from its income in bad ones. Howard had not made those mistakes because he had not made those assumptions. He had assumed the bad year was coming. He had planned for it. He had been right that it was coming. Walt had assumed the same thing for 27 years of his own farming. Dale has assumed it for 20 years more. The rule has not been tested the way 1985 tested it, not since then. But it is tested every year in November when Dale writes the entry in the ledger and confirms that the number in the net cash column is positive. Not one November entry in 65 years of farming has been negative. Howard said it once and never needed to say it again. Walt repeated it once to Dale and never needed to repeat it. Dale will say it once to whoever farms the Ingram ground after him. A farm you cannot pay for in a bad year is not your farm.